Welcome to All of This and More. I'm so excited to share my conversation with Liz Charlotte Grant, essayist, columnist, and the author of Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. Liz brings a spirit of curiosity and humility to questions of faith, doubt, and the stories that have shaped us over time. In this episode, we talk about how creative practice and spiritual life are deeply intertwined and how both require patience, openness, and a willingness to be changed. Liz shares how navigating faith, doubt, and mystery have formed her character and deepened her sense of belonging while opening her up to new ways of understanding herself and God. We discuss the role of collective memory, how the stories and legends we inherit become part of our spiritual DNA, influencing our beliefs and questions and capacity for transformation. Liz's reflections on the mysteries of faith and the importance of spiritual autonomy invite us to trust our own voices as we navigate the complexities of becoming more of our full selves. Thank you for being here for this conversation about the ways we are continually being formed by the stories we tell, hear, and receive. You can learn more about this episode and Liz's writing and work at allofthisandmore.com. Welcome to All of This and More. I'm Charlotte Donlon, and I'm so glad to be with Liz Charlotte Grant. Liz will tell us a little bit about herself, and then we will dive into some questions.
I'm happy to be here, Charlotte. I am coming to you from Aurora, Colorado, which is just outside of Denver. I am an author, a writer. I tend to do essays about whatever I want, which somehow I found myself in the very privileged and unique position to be able to do that. I'm a columnist for the Christian Century magazine, which I describe as like a Christian faith-based Harper's. Whether or not that's a fair description, you will have to decide by subscribing. And I've written a book called Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. I live in Denver with a husband who I've been married to for about 15 years, 2 kids, and a flock of chickens.
Great. Thanks so much for telling those who aren't familiar with you and your work a little bit about yourself. And I love that description of Christian Century. Perfect. Thank you for giving that to me today.
So welcome.
When I meet with writers and authors and have them on All of This and More, I like to start with questions about your writing and reading life. So that's where I want to start. My first question is, how do writing and reading help you belong to yourself, others, and the world, and the divine, and to God, if you want to answer that question too?
I love this question so much. So I happen to be married to an artist. He's a visual artist. And we talk about a lot the posture that art making puts you in as a creator, the way that you approach the world, the way that we have learned to approach the world has shifted a lot as we consider our role as artists. And so as we're observing, as we're attentive, as we are seeking and curious, that's such a big part of creative practice, creating space within yourself to be able to receive. It really is, and I know that this is a passion for you as well, Charlotte. It is this kind of spiritual forming practice to be a creative, to be able to spend time in the silence and with yourself and with other people without agenda, but with just real curiosity and empathy. Those are the kind of hallmarks of my practice. And I think most creators have that experience as well, where they realize, hey, it's not about me. Instead, it's about the whole world. It's about not even just people, but animals and beings and created things. And so being able to receive that as gift with wonder, with attention, I think that is what has really formed me and my work as an artist and as a person.
I feel like everything you just said could also be said about the spiritual life. So I think it's one reason we get along is because there is that deep understanding of the connections and parallels and interweavings if that's a word, of the creative life and the spiritual life. So, yeah,
Absolutely.
amen to all
Yeah.
of that. My next question is, how has your creative practice and creative work, and not just writing, but all of your creative explorations, how have those formed you over the years to help you be more of who you were designed to be?
The thing that is coming to mind right now as you ask that question is related to this idea of waiting and humility. Um, I'm currently waiting on a couple of kind of projects in the background and finding out if those will become reality or not just in my own mind or in my own hard drive, but beyond that. So I'm waiting to see if those are going to become reality. And as I do that, it does require this kind of open handedness to my own life. I wrote a memoir that never got published. It was about a disability that kind of came out of the blue for me. And that was a just wrenching process to try to pitch that book and have it go nowhere over kind of 2 years of pitching with an agent and to all the publishers, everyone, and to not have that go anywhere and to set that book aside and say, I'm going to write something else. So I'm not a person who enjoys having to be patient. I don't know if anybody really enjoys it, but I am a classic kind of overachiever type A student. I'm really more of a type B person. But when it comes to my work, I am just a high achiever, ambitious. I want to make good things and I want to make them well, and I can move quickly and ask other people to do that too. And that has not been how my authorial life has worked out. And so that has required something of me, releasing expectation on myself and on other people and on my work, allowing myself the space to grow. Part of it is that even growing in craft takes so much time, and there's really no shortcut for it. I often tell this to new writers, the chance to be around new writers every so often, and just love the opportunity to just tell them the only way to improve is to write, to write and to write and to do it wrong. And then to save those wrong kind of wanderings in an extra folder and hopefully come back to them. But to get out your million words, or whatever Ira Glass talks about, before you achieve mastery. And I think just having the patience with yourself and with the process, it has grown me a lot, I would say. My character, my willingness to be humbled, to be patient, to move more slowly in the world, that has all been developed in the course of writing, and not just writing, but publishing. Both of those are set up as slow processes. There's no rushing either of them. If you've ever tried to go against your publisher and push for an earlier pub date or something, good luck. Like, that is a slow moving Titanic glacial machine, right? And you're not going to move that quickly. So it's just a humbling process. I think that's really what comes to mind, my current state of mind. But I think there are plenty of other ways, but that patience and humility.
So, this has formed you primarily through the writing life, right, and publishing life. But have you seen it carry over into other areas of life?
Yeah. The relational connection between learning patience in publishing and writing and learning patience in relationship with other people. I'm married to a man who is a visual artist. He's also just a slow, methodical thinker. And the way that he moves through the world, we got married and we're evangelical Christians, just really, we might have been considered slightly edgy, but we were evangelicals. And over time, I have shifted into the main lane, and he has shifted toward not wanting to go to church anymore, which is a challenge for me. And so one of the things that we together have had to work on is just making space for each other, creating kind of openness in our own marriage to say, we don't have to be at the same place. at the same time, we can be patient with each other in our own processes, which are different because we're different people and we have different experiences that have formed us, etc. So it's been fascinating to see those opportunities to be patient come up so frequently, even as I learn this in other areas of life and my work in particular. I think relationally, I have plenty of opportunities to practice the same thing and say, I might not be right about this. I'm changing my mind, or I'm reserving judgment, and just saying, I don't really know where this is going, but it's okay. Like, I can live in this medium in between place. I will be okay.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to all of the multiple opportunities to be patient and waiting, and how we can receive things from that, and how it's also kind of awful sometimes too. I have one more question before we move into questions about the book. So right now, while you're waiting and trying to be patient and the world is not helping with everything around us, what art is comforting you and helping you, belong to yourself and others in the world in ways that feel safe and good? Like, and by art, I mean all genres and forms of high art, low art, all the in-between art.
I appreciate this question because my temptation is to tell you impressive works that I'm reading, but in reality, I have like entire comfort genres that I read. So I've been currently working my way through an audiobook, the Amelia Peabody series, which is I can't even tell you the name of the author. I think it's Elizabeth. I'll have to tell you. You can put it in the notes.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Whatever it is. But she has created this adventuring feminist archaeologist character who goes around Egypt. She's an Egyptologist, in fact, in the, I want to say, late 19th century. And that was the heyday of archaeology, really. They were going nuts down there for good and ill. And so there's a lot of discussion of those kind of things. But it is, let's be honest, it's not literature in the classic sense. I wouldn't be like, yeah, I'm going to make my nonfiction students read this book, or even fiction students. These are fictional. They have been so comforting to connect to these characters, and archaeology is an interest of mine, but I have absolutely no expertise or reason to know anything about it, really, except just interest. And so it's been fun to cosplay in her shoes for a bit. And then other than that, I watch a lot of TV, I listen to podcasts. I'm just constantly listening, and stories are animating my daily life. And so I just finished the book Metropolis, which is fiction also, and it's about a RoboCop kind of situation, which was a lot of fun, and anarchy and in Metropolis, aka New York City. And then I, like everybody, was completely obsessed with Severance. There's an extra novel to go with the TV series that I read. I was like on the Reddit boards.
Okay.
So
you did that.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
I did it. Yeah. I love the deep rabbit trail. If I can get down there, it's just so much fun to lose yourself in something like that. And as I don't know if I mentioned, I often write about politics. So I am very connected to what is happening. And so it helps to have something so disconnected, pure joy and fun. It's not doing much in the world except it's comfort, it's joyful, it's restful for me. And so I have had to give myself permission, what you like. It's okay. Like, you could be a weirdo and go down your little path, and that feeds the art in other ways.
Yes. Well, and I'm all about having joy from wherever we can get it right now, from any kind of TV shows, art, films, whatever. It's a necessity. It's a good thing.
It absolutely is. Yeah.
And thank you for being honest with me and not trying to say something that's not true or just telling me like the literary parts that sound good.
Which I read those too.
I know,
but that's not what I'm spending most of my time on. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Yes. So let's talk about Knock at the Sky now. And before I ask a few questions, I'd love for you to share a bit about the book and how it came to be.
Yeah, this was a sort of weird one for me because I'm not a biblical scholar, and this book is about the book of Genesis, like the book of origins in the Christian Bible. Really, it's the Hebrew Bible. I'm coming at it from a progressive Christian lens, Christian mainline, but from kind of the experience with this book as an evangelical Christian, where we read the book as a literal history in some ways of God in the world and how the world was made. And it's like our anti-evolution text somehow doesn't make a lot of sense actually when you get into it and go, this isn't actually telling us how the processes worked here. But I think I've gone through my own sort of evolution of faith over the years, as I've alluded to. And I think I was curious about the story. I wanted to go back to the origin story. I think I feel pretty hungry for myth and story and narrative that can make sense of my life. And particularly in this moment when we're thinking about, we live in a time of such dramatic technological advancement. Our ability to live has increased by years and years from, let's say, the medieval times. Just the way that we've been able to prolong our lives, to prolong comfort in our lives, to create our environment, all of that has increased so rapidly, so quickly, within the past 100 years. That is unique in the scope of history. And so I think that does engender a rootlessness where we feel like, where do we come from? Are we actually connected to the ground? And in some cases, people will say no. There are plenty of Christians who will say, no, we're not. We're connected to heaven. Like we're transitory on this earth, despite the theology that basically says this is heaven. God may remake things, but this is the place. There's no other place. And so I just was very curious about kind of the roots and the origins and wanted to go back to that idea. Initially, I'd set out to write about the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, and the weirdest stories about the prophets, but just found myself asking question about the voice of God and where the voice comes from and how the voice works, because of course the voice is what animates the prophets, right? So I started going backwards and stumbled into this. Where's the first time the voice appears? Literally at the beginning of the Bible. And so then you kind of have to deal with all the other stuff too. So I trapped myself into this situation where I had to write about Abraham, which I didn't want to do. But it ended up being a really fruitful experience for me. I think writing about this strange book of origins, which some parts of are 4,000 years old. So I got to write about an ancestral text, spiritual text, and provide literary criticism on it and just go from there.
Yeah, and you did a beautiful job. I
Thank you.
would like to read about every book in the Bible the way I read about Genesis in this book. No pressure, but it's just so much more interesting to me at this point in my life. Like I've read Genesis enough. I'm not saying skip Genesis and read this instead. I'm saying please read this. And like
I am.
It's so rich and it's so like generative to be curious and to open up like new ideas about what was really happening and what was going on when this was being written and by those who wrote it and that sort of thing. So one thing I'm interested in is what you discovered about yourself through writing it and publishing it and even speaking about it, even up till today. Like, what have you discovered that you didn't know about yourself before you started writing this book?
I think I realized I'm more of an anarchist heretic, like a Christian anarchist than I thought I was. Writing about the patriarchal family, the family that started faith, let's say, the first people to encounter God. I did great and just had so much fun writing about the sort of prehistory characters. Adam and Eve, Noah, what a weirdo. there Enoch, and like encountering some of those characters that are just, there's no way we can figure out the difference between myth and history in those stories and those characters. And that is fun to me. That is just play. And then, of course, Genesis hits this sort of middle. There's 3 kind of acts in Genesis, and I just write about the first 2 because personally I find Joseph to be really boring, and I don't want to write about it. I was like, that's been done. Really, all of it's been done, but I just wanted to focus on the first 2 acts. And the second act of Genesis is the story of this one family, Abraham and Isaac, and the women, Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. And that is a very dysfunctional family. And I come from a dysfunctional family. It was challenging to write about. It was really challenging, especially thinking about the way that this family dynamic has perpetuated itself across centuries. This idea of patriarchy being passed down, women being classed as secondary, if that, under the heel of men. And in particular, the story of Hagar, the enslaved woman in the household of Abraham, and Sarah, and the way that she is forced into surrogacy and then is kicked out of the family several times. And that was very difficult to write about for me. And so I end up spending a lot of time on that story because it was so difficult. But I think one of the things that I learned about myself is really just how anti-institutional I am, because so much about that marriage between Sarah and Abraham and this founding family has been institutionalized. It like represents the first kind of institution of Christian faith, and the way that it is then institutionalized across rabbinic history and then across Christian history. I feel so allergic to all of it. And so that comes across, I think, in how I write about the family. And I have found that a lot of people get stuck at that part of the book. Like when they start to, the first part of the book feels really exciting, and then they start to feel like the heaviness of this family. And I got really stuck in the middle, I personally writing the book, because I struggled so much with these dynamics. And it was really fascinating to push through and be like, what does it look like to find an imaginative center here, to find some mystery and interest, and even in an area, a story that is so challenging to me. And so I end up focusing a lot on Hagar and the way that liberation theologians read Hagar, especially womanist theologians. And that for me was so generative and beautiful to say, I am submitting my reading of this text to these other men and women of color who have experienced slavery in their histories and their family histories. And I am going to submit my own reading of this text to theirs. That felt really healing, I think, for me, but definitely did encourage my anarchist tendencies.
Well, I mean, that's a good thing to know about yourself, that you're more of an anarchist than you thought previously. One thing I'm interested in as you speak about this is the role of like collective memory and how that forms us and shapes us in various areas of life. And there's another, I think in chapter 6, you have some legends about Abram that you share. Some like how do the stories that we hear and we know get lodged in ourselves and affect us? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, let me pull up chapter 6 actually real quick, just so I
Okay.
make sure I address it directly. Yeah. In chapter 6, I talk about Abram hearing the voice of God and leaving, and why I really wrestle with the question of why would someone believe a voice from heaven? Why does that matter? And there's one of the things that I try to do in this book is spend a lot of time with rabbinic commentary on these books, including rabbinic legend. So there's a lot of legend in the Jewish, and your Jewish listeners, they know this is not new. I'm not doing something new here. but there's so much written around the words of the Bible because there's a lot of white space, right? There's a lot of unknown, and the Jewish people do a really good job of creating midrashic accounts that surround these stories and provide a deeper understanding of the motivations for the characters, and also give a sense of why these things matter in our time. I have found it so generative to spend time with these stories, even though many of them are just myths themselves and made up around. One of the myths you're talking about is the story of Abraham having heard God's voice before he hears the call of God to leave his home. And that was so fascinating to me, to say the reason that Abraham listened to God and left his homeland was because he'd already been communing with God. He'd already been talking to God. And that is just such a different read on this story than I had heard before. It really gives a very different inflection to God and Abraham's relationship than I had seen in the past. And so, yeah, I think it makes a difference. These stories that we imbibe, they really shape the family narrative, the way that we move forward. I tell a story in the book about my daughter's birth. I think it's actually in this chapter too, where she actually heard our voices and stopped crying because she already knew our speech. Because when she had been in my body, she had been already learning our speech, because that is what infants do. That's what fetuses do. It's just wild. They start learning speech before they're even born, and they're able to then recognize the speech of their parents upon their birth. And this is just a common, probably misconception that parents, I think, know this intuitively, but this is a new understanding from science that these fetuses' understanding of language begins in the womb, including pronunciation, including the tone, of course, the tone of the parents' voices, but also just even the language itself, the unique language that the parents speak. They begin to learn that in the womb. And I think that idea of kind of the stories that we pass down, that's a maternal image, right? That Abraham would have already been talking with God. And the legends don't necessarily tell the story that way, but one of the legends is that Abraham is actually abandoned in a cave because King Nimrod, who is described as this mighty man in Genesis, and then the rabbis decide must be the king of Babylon who has built the Tower of Babel, and so he's this extra evil character in the Genesis narrative. So the rabbis then say, okay, Abraham lived in that city. His king was Nimrod, and Nimrod has a dream in which he is told that a baby will supplant him. And that baby is Abraham, of course, we come to understand. His mother births him in a cave in the desert and leaves him there to die. And instead, the angel Gabriel actually nurses him with his finger. So he starts like sucking on Gabriel's finger and milk comes out. And it happens to be like supercharged milkshake milk, because then within 10 days, Abraham is walking and talking through the desert. He runs into his mother. He's reunited. There's all this backstory behind that. But it is this idea of already God and Abraham having this unique and intimate relationship. And instead of an anonymous deity from the sky just speaking at, like a command at this man to change his whole life, instead it becomes this kind of intimate invitation to Abraham to leave and follow this being that has always been calling him. And that's a very different way to see the story.
It really is. And it sort of opens us up. Well, like everything's already happening, right? Before we think we're making it happen. So it's sort of like one of the first times the thing was happening before it happened, I love that that story and that example and the example of your daughter and when children are born, that they already know like the shapes of words that we speak as their specific parents, right? Of course, it's already been happening, you know? And so it just makes me be curious. I'm like, well, what else is already happening that I think is not happening yet? Right. So thank you
I
for,
love thinking about that.
yeah.
The dimensions of time and the way that the spiritual life and the material world interact. Those are mysteries to us. We don't understand that. We would like to imagine that we do. But I think one of the things that was so sweet about studying these stories is seeing the multi-layered dimensionality that exists within these narratives. Many of which, like, maybe there's some truth to them, maybe they're just myth, but they mattered in the course of history, right? These stories mattered to the people who told them, and they passed them down over time. And again, that idea of memory and the way that these stories influence the way we live, all of that is baked into this idea of the Bible continuing to have something to offer, but also Abraham hearing from God. And it just changes us. Stories change us. I know you believe that as much as I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear a bit from your book that you wrote because you needed to read it. And maybe
Yeah.
now that's changing others because now we get to read it.
I think I needed to hear somebody say that they could be wrong about God. So I'm going to read you this paragraph. I admit I fear being wrong about God. What if I've received God with confusion instead of clarity? My native evangelicalism values certainty. Like the scientists of the Enlightenment, we prefer to quantify, measure, sift, and bottle. We value argumentation and decisiveness. We dismiss doubt and paradox. If we could catch God in a net, ping God to a board to collect dust, and then study God from every angle, I suspect we would do it. Yet I am beginning to suspect that the hike toward God resists a plan. Does any one of us contain the map of spirituality? Wandering may be inevitable.
Yes. Unfortunately, sometimes. Well,
Yeah,
fortunately and unfortunately, it's like it's the thing we don't want. And then we do it, we wander, we wait, we twist and turn, and it ended up being what we needed. So, yeah, it is full of nuance and paradox and just being present to what's unfolding, like maybe that's it. It's not so much about like having it all figured out, but being present to what we notice in the moment.
absolutely. Yeah.
I'd love to hear one more excerpt from your book. Since you mentioned your daughter's birth, will you read the passage where that story shows up?
Sure.
Okay, great.
The inner ear matures in a fetus at 16 weeks gestation. From that point, babies respond to their own personal soundscapes. They leap and pummel their mother's insides at surprise noises, ordinary speech, bumps, and burps. Even with organs and amniotic fluid insulating external sound waves, a fetus can perceive low frequencies. Her mother's muffled speech makes up the background of her days. The mother is already preparing her offspring to communicate with her, and the baby, too, is already in training, noticing the inflections of her mother's pronunciation by osmosis. I first understood this mystery of early recognition at my daughter's birth. When she fell into my husband's open palms, she spluttered, coughed, and then wailed, furious at the light, the cold, the open air. It's okay, my husband and I cooed. Baby, my baby, you're okay. And the light switching on, the child went still. She opened her eyes and searched. She found my eyes and stared, then turned and looked into her father's eyes. Back and forth her eyes traveled between our faces. Time slowed, then stopped as we stared into the eyes of this foreigner, this child who recognized us by our voices. Our presence meant safety to her because she already knew us. We had met before.
Beautiful. Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to share about the book before we wrap up?
I think whenever I have told people I'm writing about Genesis, it does provoke strong reactions. And I think all of those reactions are okay. I know that people come from different places in faith and different of comfort with the Bible. I am really okay with that. I know I was joking earlier about you should read my book instead of Genesis. But actually, there are plenty of amazing resources, including a few months, probably 6 or 7 months before my book came out. You may have heard of Marilyn Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She came out with a book called Reading Genesis. And for some readers, that is a better book for them. It goes through Genesis more like a commentary. And in fact, recently I had a kind of tough review that found that book much more useful than mine. And frankly, I am okay with that. The fact is, when we engage these texts that have so much spiritual memory attached to them, even so much embodied memory, right? I think there are different ways that we need to engage. And I just want to say, the goal of my book was spiritual autonomy for people. It is not to tell people how to think. It is not to tell people how to construct a faith or deconstruct a faith or whatever. My goal is spiritual and creative autonomy. And if I can cultivate that in readers, then I have done well. I have met my goals. And so I think, especially for folks who have some history with the Bible, I just want to encourage them to trust their own voice as they approach this text. And that may include buying my book, which I certainly would not mind. But it may include just never opening the book again and stuffing their Bible into the nearest garbage disposal. And that's okay too. I really trust that the journey that each of us is on spiritually is the one we need to take. And so I just want to offer you permission to go on that journey.
That's a beautiful invitation. And I appreciate how your book is accompanying me on a more imaginative reading of the Bible. It's in ways that help me know more of myself and more of God, and more surety about who I am with God and in God. So at least with me, your wish has come true. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. That's kind.
And I'm sure it's come true for others too. And I definitely recommend Knock at the Sky to anyone who has not read it yet. That's what it looks like. It's beautiful, beautiful book. We didn't even talk about this book as an object. We might have to do this again soon and talk more about different things.
We can bring my husband on. He'll tell you about the art.
Yes, that'd be great. That'd be great. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Liz. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day. Have a good week. And I hope that you're able to inhabit your waiting in ways that are meaningful and good most of the time.
Amen. May it be. Appreciate you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.